This morning, October 17th, the unthinkable happened. The Crimean Bridge, a symbol of Russia's control and pride, was completely destroyed in a series of explosions that echoed across the Kerch Strait. By midday, Russian state media were struggling to find words, alternating between silence and confusion. The official version remains fragmented. Some outlets speak of technical malfunctions, others of terrorist sabotage. But according to several independent sources, the bridge is gone. Not damaged, gone. The destruction severed the only reliable land connection between Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, leaving millions effectively cut off from supplies, fuel, and cash. Within hours, queues formed at gas stations, banks restricted withdrawals, and the peninsula slipped into isolation. At first glance, this looks like another episode in a long chain of attacks. But this time everything is different. The explosion didn't just hit concrete and steel, it hit the psychological core of the Russian state narrative. For years, Moscow presented the bridge as proof of stability, permanence, inevitability. Now, that symbol lies in ruins, broadcast across social media by dozens of shaky videos filmed from the shore. The images show collapsed spans, flaming debris, and the dark water below illuminated by rescue vessels. What's striking is the silence: no air defense alarms, no official warnings. Just a sudden, irreversible break. According to our sources, the incident occurred in the early hours, just before dawn. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western experts shows at least 2 distinct blast points along the central section, suggesting the use of precision charges placed under the structure. Russian authorities immediately closed the airspace above the Kerch region and blocked all civilian communications. Even domestic news agencies have been instructed to wait for an official line. But the line never came. By late morning, the Ministry of Transport had removed all references to the bridge from its website, and the traffic monitoring services stopped displaying its status. In effect, the bridge ceased to exist, both physically and digitally. Meanwhile, on the ground in Crimea, the situation deteriorates by the hour. Fuel supplies have run dry, and residents describe panic at gas stations. Cash shortages emerged almost instantly. Without the bridge, armored vehicles carrying currency can't cross, and the ferry routes are overwhelmed. Several banks introduced withdrawal limits, others simply shut down their ATMs. Local businesses report that card payments no longer process. Everything stopped, one store owner in Simferopol told local media before the interview was deleted. We can't refuel, we can't restock, we can't even withdraw our own money. In Moscow, the government's reaction is cautious, almost mechanical. No emergency session of parliament, no televised address, only brief comments about stabilization measures. But inside the ministries, panic is real. According to our sources, internal chats among regional administrators filled with urgent instructions to ensure continuity of fuel distribution and control public mood. In plain words, they fear unrest. And as the hours pass, that fear grows. Subscribe to stay ahead of the next stage, because, according to insiders, the destruction of the Crimean Bridge is not the end of an era. It's the beginning of one, a day when Russia woke up cut off from its own illusion of control. By midday, the scale of the disaster was becoming impossible to hide. Fuel trucks lined the roads leading out of Kerch, motionless, their drivers stranded with empty tanks. On social networks, Crimean residents posted desperate messages asking for gasoline, cash, even drinking water. The local authorities kept repeating the same phrase: logistics are being restored, but there were no signs of any movement. Satellite photos taken this morning show miles of vehicles backed up along the approaches to the destroyed bridge, with rescue crews only visible on the Russian mainland side. From the peninsula itself, no convoys were seen departing. The isolation was complete. Inside Russia, the shock is profound. The Crimean Bridge was not just a transport route, it was a political monument, a physical statement of permanence. And now that monument has collapsed. According to insiders in Moscow, the Kremlin's first reaction was disbelief. Early reports from the Ministry of Defense insisted the bridge had sustained minor damage, but when aerial reconnaissance confirmed that several spans had sunk, the narrative abruptly shifted. The federal news agencies were ordered to minimize coverage until official instructions. This phrase, familiar to anyone inside the Russian bureaucracy, is code for crisis. But the crisis extends far beyond communications. The destruction of the bridge severed not only supply lines but also the invisible arteries of the regional economy. Crimean fuel reserves, normally replenished every 48 hours, are now critically low. Analysts warn that by the end of the day, all major gas stations will run dry. Banks have limited cash distribution to 5,000 rubles per customer, and credit card systems are failing due to overloaded satellite channels. In Sevastopol and Simferopol, people gather outside ATMs, hoping for a signal, for a transaction to go through, for something resembling normal life. Yet, every hour brings new restrictions. According to our sources within Russia's energy sector, emergency fuel convoys were prepared on the mainland, but without the bridge, there is no viable route to deliver them quickly. The ferry capacity is too small, and weather conditions make it unreliable. Discussions of temporary airlifts have begun, but experts doubt such operations can sustain the region for more than a few days. It's not a question of fuel, it's a question of logistics, one industry insider explained. The peninsula is an island now, and islands are expensive to keep alive. Meanwhile, Moscow's silence becomes more telling than any statement. By noon, the Kremlin had not announced an investigation, had not named a culprit, had not promised retaliation. Instead, anonymous sources in state media began floating familiar terms: provocation, terrorist act, Western coordination. The repetition feels mechanical, as if designed to fill time while officials decide what to do. In diplomatic circles, however, the tone is different. Several European embassies reported unusual consultations with Russian counterparts early this morning, a sign that even Moscow's allies were caught off guard. But deeper inside the Russian system, panic is spreading through economic channels. The ruble's value plummeted on internal trading platforms. Stock prices of transport and energy companies dropped sharply. By mid-morning, the central bank was forced to halt several transactions, citing technical instability. In reality, traders simply stopped believing the numbers. As one economist close to the finance ministry put it, the bridge was a symbol of connection. When it fell, the illusion of continuity fell with it. And yet, the most dangerous consequence is not financial. It's psychological. For years, Russians were told that Crimea was unshakable, untouchable, eternal. Now, for the first time, that illusion has collapsed. The shock has reached ordinary people far beyond the peninsula. Even in Moscow and St. Petersburg, conversations on the street are quieter. The words, "we lost the bridge," are spoken with disbelief, and behind that disbelief lies a question few dare to voice aloud: if the bridge is gone, what else can disappear next? But insiders warn that this is only the first wave of disruption. The physical destruction is visible. The economic impact is measurable. What comes next is less predictable: the reaction of a system that suddenly realizes it has lost control of its own symbols. And according to sources close to the Kremlin, the next decisions will determine not the fate of the bridge, but the future of the entire Russian narrative itself. By early afternoon, Russia's information landscape began to fragment under the weight of silence. The state channels broadcast carefully edited footage, distant shots of smoke, close-ups of officials in uniforms, statements about emergency repairs. Yet, anyone with access to the internet could see the truth. The bridge was gone. Entire spans had collapsed into the sea, leaving only twisted supports and burning debris. Independent analysts estimated that restoring even partial functionality could take months, perhaps longer. For Crimea, that means months without a reliable connection to the mainland, months of shortage, instability, and fear. Inside the peninsula, the situation was deteriorating quickly. Fuel reserves ran out by midday. Long queues formed outside gas stations, some stretching for several kilometers. Witnesses described arguments, shouting, and scuffles as people tried to fill jerry cans before supplies were exhausted. In Simferopol, the police were deployed to control the crowds. In Sevastopol, local authorities issued rationing orders: 10 liters of fuel per vehicle, effective immediately. Public transport reduced schedules, buses simply stopped running. Residents posted videos showing streets darkening as traffic lights shut down to save electricity. "It's not just fuel," one local commented online before her post was deleted. "It feels like the peninsula is slowly suffocating." Meanwhile, the financial collapse was spreading faster than any official response. Banks across Crimea introduced severe withdrawal limits, while card transactions froze altogether. Within hours, small businesses began to close, not because of a lack of goods, but because payments no longer processed. Without the bridge, cash could not physically enter the region. Trucks carrying currency were stranded on the mainland, and air deliveries were restricted by security orders. By early afternoon, the peninsula had effectively reverted to a cashless, fuel-less economy. People resorted to bartering, food for gasoline, medicine for cash. In Moscow, the internal reports arriving from Crimea were described by one government insider as worse than expected. Ministries argued over how to respond. The Transport Ministry insisted that alternative routes via ferry would suffice, but the Defense Ministry warned that ferry capacity covered no more than 5% of previous traffic. One official report used unusually blunt language: "Sustainment of the peninsula in current conditions is untenable." That line, according to our sources, was immediately removed from the final version before presentation to higher authorities. But beyond logistics, something deeper began to shift. In the corridors of power, officials spoke of the incident not as a military or technical failure, but as an existential one. "The bridge was not just infrastructure," said one senior bureaucrat in a private conversation. "It was the story we told ourselves about who we are." Its destruction shattered that story. For years, Crimea had been portrayed as proof of Russia's endurance, of its ability to defy isolation. Now, it stands as proof of vulnerability, of limits the system cannot admit even to itself. The propaganda machine, usually quick to adapt, seemed paralyzed. Television hosts looked visibly unsettled. Segments once filled with patriotic slogans now carried a subdued tone, discussing temporary disruptions and the complexity of engineering tasks. Online, however, the narrative slipped out of control. Even pro-government bloggers expressed disbelief, posting questions the authorities couldn't answer. How could the bridge be destroyed so easily? Why were there no defenses? And what happens now that the lifeline to Crimea is gone? As these questions multiplied, the economic ripples began to hit the mainland. Fuel prices rose overnight in southern Russia as refineries redirected reserves toward emergency supplies. Freight shipments through the region were delayed, creating shortages hundreds of kilometers away. In financial markets, traders described the day as organized chaos. The ruble continued to slide despite massive interventions from the central bank. But the deeper damage was psychological. Investors and citizens alike began to grasp that something fundamental had broken. Still, Moscow remains publicly calm. Officials continue to use familiar phrases: under control, temporary inconvenience, resilience. But in private, they know the truth. The system built on the illusion of stability has lost its cornerstone. The bridge's destruction is not simply an attack on infrastructure, it is an attack on belief, the belief that nothing could truly reach inside Russia's protected space. And according to multiple sources within the Kremlin, tonight's closed meetings will not be about reconstruction or recovery. They will be about narrative survival. The question is no longer how to rebuild the bridge, but how to convince the country that it still stands, even as the sea swallows what remains of it. By late afternoon, the scale of the crisis had grown far beyond the physical destruction of the Crimean Bridge. The shockwaves were now spreading through every layer of the Russian system: military, economic, and psychological. Inside government buildings in Moscow, phones rang nonstop. Each ministry was drafting its own version of events, each trying to control a story that no longer obeyed orders. The Ministry of Defense circulated a statement calling the explosion a coordinated act of sabotage, while the investigative committee insisted it was an industrial incident. The contradictions only deepened public mistrust. On social media, even verified accounts linked to state agencies began deleting posts within minutes, as if words themselves had become dangerous. In Crimea, the situation entered a new phase. Fuel supplies had completely run out. The peninsula's main storage facilities were drained by morning, and emergency reserves, intended for hospitals and power plants, were already being rationed. Public transport ceased entirely. Taxi drivers parked their cars in long, silent rows and left their keys on dashboards, a symbolic gesture of helplessness. Supermarkets stayed open but shelves emptied quickly, not from panic buying but from halted logistics. Ferry routes across the Kerch Strait were paralyzed by weather, and with the bridge gone, the peninsula became a closed loop. Even local officials began to use a word previously banned in public speech: blockade. According to our sources in Sevastopol, authorities quietly began relocating administrative offices inland. Key officials were flown to the mainland early this morning for consultations, though few expect them to return soon. The military garrisons, deprived of direct supply routes, switched to emergency rations. The remaining fuel reserves are reportedly being redirected exclusively to the army. Civilian use, one officer admitted off record, is no longer a priority. The peninsula, effectively, has entered survival mode. But the collapse is not limited to logistics. The financial system is disintegrating in real time. The Bank of Russia's internal data, seen by our sources, shows a dramatic spike in transaction failures across southern regions. The failure rate exceeds 60% in Crimea itself. The central bank's emergency measures, freezing cash withdrawals and halting transfers, have only accelerated the loss of confidence. In several cities, local businesses stopped accepting the ruble altogether, switching to barter or foreign currency. The ruble lost meaning here the moment the bridge fell, said a small business owner in Yalta. We can't get fuel, we can't get food, and now our money doesn't buy anything. Meanwhile, across Russia's southern provinces, the panic is spreading. Fuel prices surged overnight. Queues formed at gas stations in Krasnodar and Rostov-on-Don as rumors circulated that reserves were being diverted toward the military. The Ministry of Energy denied the claims, but the pattern was unmistakable: empty tanks, anxious drivers, rising tension. For a country that built its identity on the image of energy abundance, the irony was bitter. For the first time in decades, Russians were asking whether the state could keep the lights on. Behind the scenes, the Kremlin's internal reaction was described by one insider as fractured and fearful. High-level officials reportedly clashed during emergency meetings. Some demanded immediate retaliation and a full military escalation. Others warned that the loss of the bridge had already weakened the logistical backbone of any potential offensive. "We are shouting into an echo chamber," said one participant. "No one wants to admit what everyone already knows: this is a collapse of control." Even Russia's information machine, usually disciplined, precise, and relentless, began to falter. The main evening broadcast struggled to fill airtime without showing visuals of the destroyed bridge. Instead, anchors recited long monologues about resilience, engineering miracles, and unbreakable unity. But the tone had changed. The usual triumphal cadence was replaced with something slower, cautious, almost defensive. In the absence of images, the silence itself became evidence. The psychological damage runs deeper than the infrastructure loss. The bridge was not just a route, it was the narrative of inevitability, the proof that history could be physically engineered. Its collapse has exposed the vulnerability of the entire idea of control. The myth of untouchability, the notion that Russian power is immune to failure, has cracked in full view of its citizens. For millions, this moment marks an awakening. If the state could not protect its proudest symbol, what else has it failed to defend? And yet, even as the disaster unfolds, officials still speak in abstractions. They promise stability, continuity, and the restoration of supply. But these words, once powerful, now sound hollow. In Crimea, no one believes them. In Moscow, few repeat them. Across the country, the silence grows heavier, the silence of disbelief, of fatigue, of a nation realizing that the bridge was never just a structure. It was a promise. And that promise has sunk beneath the waves of the Kerch Strait. As evening approaches, the question is no longer whether Russia can rebuild the bridge. It is whether it can rebuild faith, in its government, in its economy, in its own future. And behind closed doors, officials already know, the answer will not be found in concrete or steel. It will depend on whether a system built on illusion can survive a day when illusion itself was destroyed. By early evening, the shock had transformed into something heavier, not panic, but recognition. Russia, for the first time in decades, was forced to look at itself without the armor of propaganda. The destruction of the Crimean Bridge was no longer just a strategic failure or a technical catastrophe. It had become a mirror, one reflecting everything the system had been hiding. The confident speeches about resilience, the endless reports of stability, the myth of control, all shattered within a single day. What remained was a country suspended between disbelief and anger, searching for meaning in the silence that followed. According to sources within Russia's Security Council, the closed meeting that took place this afternoon was unlike any in recent memory. There were no long briefings, no charts, no applause. Just silence, interrupted occasionally by raised voices. The topic was not reconstruction, it was containment, how to contain the social and economic fallout before it spreads beyond Crimea. Several ministries proposed immediate rationing of fuel and cash on the mainland. Others warned that such measures would trigger panic faster than any news report. "We've lost control of the narrative," admitted one official. "Now we are managing emotions, not logistics." Those words, according to insiders, defined the mood of the entire room. Meanwhile, the situation in Crimea had reached the edge of collapse. Fuel reserves were depleted. Supermarkets closed as delivery trucks stopped coming. The internet connection was unstable, power outages became frequent, and mobile networks faltered. Residents compared the day's events to the first days of isolation during past crises, but this time, there was no reassurance that help would come. Ferry operations halted by evening due to worsening weather, leaving the peninsula completely cut off. Even government representatives began to evacuate their families to the mainland. "We were told to stay calm," said a local administrator, "but when officials start disappearing, you understand that calm is a luxury." On the mainland, the psychological shock turned into an economic storm. The ruble collapsed on offshore exchanges despite the central bank's desperate intervention. By the end of the day, trading had to be suspended entirely. Domestic banks froze foreign currency withdrawals, and the Moscow exchange quietly adjusted opening hours due to maintenance. In reality, there was nothing left to trade. Large corporations halted operations in southern Russia as supply routes broke down. Analysts in London and Berlin described the moment as the beginning of a full-scale economic fracture. For Russia's leadership, it was the nightmare they had long feared, a visible, measurable crack in the facade of stability. But even worse was what began happening in people's minds. Across cities and towns, conversations changed tone. No one spoke openly of blame, not yet. But everyone spoke of disbelief. Taxi drivers, factory workers, teachers, even soldiers' families began using the same phrase, "It shouldn't have been possible." That phrase carried more weight than any protest. It meant the population was beginning to understand that the myths of protection and permanence were just that, myths. The loss of the bridge had pierced the psychological barrier that separated Russian life from the truth of its fragility. Inside state media, the pressure was unbearable. Editors received hourly instructions from the presidential administration, what to say, what to ignore, which images to delete. Yet even the most loyal commentators struggled to maintain the illusion. Viewers noticed the hesitation in their voices, the tremor behind every phrase. In the evening broadcasts, the destruction was finally acknowledged, a tragic incident caused by enemy interference. But the footage told another story: vast steel beams lying in the sea, smoke drifting over the ruins, rescue boats circling in silence. The image that had once embodied national pride was now an open wound. At the same time, the Kremlin's attempts to control the financial panic only deepened it. The central bank introduced capital restrictions and suspended major corporate transactions. Fuel exports were quietly halted for domestic stabilization. Yet on the ground, queues at gas stations stretched into the night. In major cities, citizens began withdrawing savings in cash, fearing that the banking system might follow the bridge into collapse. The more the government insisted that everything was under control, the more people understood it was not. And yet, the most striking part of this day was not the chaos, but the stillness. In Moscow, traffic was lighter than usual. In St. Petersburg, the usually crowded cafes stood half empty. There were no rallies, no mass protests, just a strange, collective quiet. People were processing what had happened, and what it meant. For the first time in years, the illusion of untouchability had been broken not by foreign sanctions or political speeches, but by physics, by reality itself. According to diplomatic sources, tonight several foreign governments were warned that Russia might redefine its strategic posture. It's a phrase that can mean anything, or everything. But those familiar with the Kremlin's mindset say that the leadership now faces an impossible dilemma, whether to double down on confrontation or admit to vulnerability. Either path leads to risk. Either path means rewriting the story Russia has told itself for a decade. And so the day ends not with words, but with an image, the dark silhouette of the Kerch Strait, the twisted remains of the bridge glinting under searchlights, the waves reflecting the fire that still burns where concrete once met steel. No one speaks of victory anymore. No one speaks of repair. In the silence of the night, the realization settles in: the bridge did not just connect two shores. It connected Russia to its own illusion of power. And now that connection is gone. Subscribe to stay ahead of what comes next, because, according to our sources, the real collapse hasn't started yet. What the world saw today was not the end, but the first visible crack in a system built entirely on the belief that nothing could ever fall.